Wilcox and Knock present a completely different version of the equity theory in suggesting, and I quote, "Perceptions of justice in the division of family responsibilities are shaped, among other things, by the ideological commitments of women. These ideological commitments have been greatly influenced by increased female involvement in the labor force, which resulted in a shift in gender roles around the 60s and the rise of housework distribution as a source of marital conflict." Wilcox and Knock explain that traditional women view housework as feminine, thereby being less likely to perceive unequal housework distribution as unfair, less likely to experience marital conflict, and more likely to perceive equity as more complex as opposed to simple equality. The authors also highlight the likelihood of traditional women encouraging high emotional work from their husbands because they have fewer demands compared to their liberal counterparts who present a greater likelihood of being angered by unequal distribution of housework and cause marital conflict. The relative deprivation theory suggests that individuals' subjective assessment of a particular situation, as opposed to the objective conditions of the situation, determine the perception of fairness. In other words, individuals' perceptions of fairness are largely based on comparison as opposed to the actual circumstances of a situation. Olah and Galler, in assessing gender role attitudes, argue that women in dual-earner relationships and more liberal societies are more likely to perceive the distribution of housework as unfair. The authors argue, and I quote, "Wives who adopt more egalitarian gender role attitudes often perceive their marriages as less rewarding, report less marital happiness, more disagreement, and a higher proneness for divorce than wives with stable, and more traditional, gender role attitudes. Husbands who adopt more egalitarian gender role attitudes report higher marital quality than husbands reporting no change in gender role attitudes." The institutional model of marriage challenges the companionate model through the argument that egalitarianism does not support marriage, especially because of minimal participation from marriage-oriented institutions, such as religious organizations. Wilcox and Knock observe that traditional women are happier because they associate marriage with high levels of morality and are affiliated with institutions that support marriage. The model predicts that women are happier in marriage if they are committed to it, involved with marriage-oriented institutions, and if they share commitment sources with their husbands. Wilcox and Knock assert that, on the one hand, wives with a strong commitment to marriage are pressured to construct a family and depend on their husbands independent of their actions. On the other hand, the normative and social support of marriage promotes wives' marital happiness by reducing the need to constantly assess the unions on the scale of whether it is meeting personal interests. In other words, the collective interest of partners is prioritized over individual interests. Commitment to the institution of marriage replaces the need for self-fulfillment with mutual support, sacrifice, and fidelity. With exception of shared commitment leading to distinct marital behavior by the husband, Wilcox and Knock report that wives committed to marriage reported greater levels of well-being because commitment promotes trust. Men committed to marriage provide emotional support, include third parties who are interested in marital success, and these men are more trusting and devoted to their wives. The Gender Revolution Framework was developed as an alternative to the Second Demographic Transition Framework, which suggests that dramatic changes in attitudes and norms towards individual freedom and self-actualization are accompanied by changes towards low fertility and diversity in union formation. The second demographic transition was obviously preceded by the first, which was characterized by a decline in fertility and mortality rates and massive population growth because the decline in mortality rates was higher than that of fertility rates. Industrialization, especially modernization or social and economic development, was the primary driver of the first demographic transition because it increased children's survival rate, the cost of parenting, and the need for family planning. The first transition supported the universal expectation of marriage and parenthood. Zaidi and Morgan argue, and I quote, "The second demographic transition entails sustained sub-replacement fertility, a multitude of living arrangements other than marriage, the disconnection between marriage and procreation, and no stationary population, with the driver of the trends being changes towards the acceptance of postmodern attitudes and norms." The features of the second demographic transition include the weakening of marriage as the primary family structure, changes in family relations from focusing on children to focusing on parents, changes in contraceptive use from preventive to self-fulfilling through the postponement of childlessness, and the increased formation of pluralistic as opposed to uniform families. Olah and Gall observe that the characteristics of the second demographic transition in the developed world include marriage deferment, decline in marriage rates, prevalence of committed relationships, especially cohabitation, low fertility rates, delaying parenthood, increased partner dissolution, and substitution of the breadwinner homemaker model with a dual earner model. The authors argue that women's economic independence has gradually been accompanied by the increased preference for egalitarian couples. The differences between the first and second demographic transitions are associated with variations in the drivers, particularly a shift from the interest in smaller families to delays in fertility or voluntary childlessness. The second demographic transition dates back to the Second World War because the war was linked to increased premarital sex and a decline in the age of individuals' first sexual encounter. These changes did not affect the overall societal attitudes towards the confinement of sexual relations to marriage. Early marriages and contraceptive technology, especially the pill and IUD, weakened the link between marriage and childbearing. Zaidi and Morgan observe that the second demographic transition is divided into three phases. The first phase, between 1955 and 1970, was characterized by increased divorce, reduced fertility, increased contraceptive use, and a halt in the decline of age of first marriage. The second phase, between 1970 and 1985, witnessed a rise in premarital cohabitation and non-marital fertility. The third phase, which happened from 1985 onwards, was characterized by a plateau in divorce rates, decline of remarriage rates, and a rise in fertility rates. The theory of comparative advantage suggests that partner specialization in paid and unpaid labor raises the total utility of marriage. The theory acknowledges that boys and girls are raised differently in terms of union-related specialization, and as such, traditional setups involve women assuming homemaking responsibilities while men take up the breadwinning ones. Becker and colleagues argue that specialization in paid and unpaid labor allows partners to work more efficiently since each partner gains a comparative advantage in their area of socialization. The authors maintain, and I quote, "Men with relatively high earnings potential gain more from marriage than men with relatively low earnings potential, not only because of the higher level of their income but also because of greater gains from specialization within marriage, since their mates have a comparative advantage in specializing in non-market investments." Gonalons, Pons and Gangle present the economic specialization theory, which, similar to the comparative advantage theory, suggests that marriage-related economic arrangements, such as unemployed husband or breadwinning wives, destabilize marriage because they minimize the utilities of being in a union, thereby reducing the gains of staying in a relationship as opposed to leaving it. Gonalons, Pons and Gangle also shed light on the financial stress theory, which associates financial instability with a higher risk of divorce because economic worries increase the frequency and severity of marital conflict. According to Killewald, managing financial strains provides more leisure time for couples to bond and reduces marital conflict. Seigel-Rushton argues against the comparative advantage theory by suggesting that specialization is not the only approach to increasing marital utility, and industrialization increase the risk in the labor markets, thereby raising the need for diversification. For instance, the joint consumption of goods, such as housing, increase economic savings. Thus, utility gains in marriage are independent of who specializes in what. Hollande Galler documents some studies concluding that female employment increases marital utilities that come with reduced economic vulnerability in families, and egalitarian relationships improves marital stability through mutual understanding, empathy, and intimacy. Seigel-Rushton, in arguing against traditional specialization setups, discredits the social role theory and advocates for dual-earner unions that provide more cushion in breadwinning and homemaking roles. The comparative advantage theory, in advocating for the significance of socialization, relies on the social role theory to point out who specializes in what. A notable difference between the specialization and bargaining theories is that specialization-related theories associate female employment with increased risk of marital instability, while bargaining theories link female employment to increased marital stability due to the benefits of having egalitarian unions. Hollande Galler argue that a possible reason for the fact that female employment might not increase marital stability is that it does not translate into increased male involvement in unpaid labor. Female involvement in economic activities outside the home is slowly becoming a norm, while male involvement in housework is not. Sayer and colleagues assert that women's implementation of the bargaining theory is likely to fail, thus they use access to resources to exit unions as opposed to bettering negotiations. Sayer and colleagues' assertion is supported by Killewald, who, through the economic independence perspective, argues that reduced financial dependence on the marriage increases the risk of marital dissolution.